Thank you very much for the kind welcome, Tariq. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here in Doha and to be talking to you. The subject I'm going to talk about, as you know, is the events after October 7th in the Middle East and how they relate to the wider international system, how they relate to international politics, or what most of you would call the global order. That's what I want to talk about. And the way I want to proceed is I want to start by talking about the international system today. I want to give you a template for thinking about international politics across the planet. And then when I'm done doing that, I want to talk about what has been happening in the Middle East since October 7th and relate it to that picture that I draw of the broader international system. So let me start by talking about what the international system looks like today. And be aware as I talk that I'm giving you an American perspective. But given that the United States is the most powerful state on the planet, I think it makes eminently good sense to do this from an American perspective. The starting point for thinking about international politics on a global scale is to think about the polarity of the system, which is another way of saying how many great powers there are in the international system. When I was born in December 1947, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two great powers on the planet. We lived in a bipolar world. In 1989, the Cold War ended, and as all of you know, in December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and we went from a bipolar world to a unipolar world, where the only great power in the world was the United States. Then, at roughly about 2017, the world stopped being unipolar and it became multipolar. There were now, and this of course is true today, three great powers in the international system. The United States, which is still the most powerful state on the planet, China, which is a reasonably close second, and Russia, which is a distant third. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers. China is not that far away from the United States, and it's why the United States considers China to be a peer competitor. So basically what I'm saying to you is that we went from bipolarity to unipolarity to multipolarity. And most of you came of age during the unipolar moment. And then in 2017, as I said, the world changed in fundamental ways. The architecture or the structure of the system changed. And the architecture of the system matters enormously. And the fact that we're now in a multipolar world is something that you want to pay careful attention to today and moving forward. Now, what does that multipolar world look like? Basically, you have a world in which the United States remains the dominant power. And the United States focuses on three particular areas of the world. East Asia, because China is located there. Europe, because Russia is located there. And the Persian Gulf, because that's where the oil is. The three areas of the world that matter the most to the United States are East Asia, Europe, and the Persian Gulf. And today, the most important area of the world for the United States is East Asia, because that's where China, which is the peer competitor, is located. So many of you have heard all this talk over the recent years about the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia is designed to move American military forces out of Europe and out of the Persian Gulf and to focus them in East Asia where they can concentrate on containing China. In an ideal world, the United States would have a peaceful Middle East, the United States would have a peaceful Europe, and it would be able to concentrate its efforts on containing China. Moreover, in an ideal world, the United States would be an ally of Russia. If you want to think about this, you've got three great powers in the world: the United States, China, and Russia. If there are three great powers in the world and the peer competitor is China, from an American point of view, you want the Russians on your side of the ledger. Very important to have the Russians with you against the Chinese. But if you think about what the world looks like today, the United States is pinned down in the Middle East. It is pinned down in the Ukraine war, and it is unable to pivot to Asia to contain China, to fully pivot to Asia to contain China, because it's pinned down in these two regions of the world. And very importantly, instead of having Russia as an ally, because the United States has gotten deeply involved in the Ukraine war against Russia, we, in effect, we meaning the Americans, have pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. So from an American point of view, we're in deep trouble today. Let me say one more word about the Middle East. When I say that the United States is pinned down in the Middle East, it's very important to understand, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about the events after October 7th, that the United States is pinned down in the Middle East because the United States is joined at the hip with Israel. It's very important to understand that the United States has a relationship with Israel that has no parallel in recorded history. The United States supports Israel unconditionally, and that's especially true when it comes to the Palestinian issue. The United States and Israel are more than just normal allies. The United States, again, supports Israel no matter what. So when we talk about Israel being deeply involved in this war or that war in the Middle East, you want to understand that means the United States is involved as well, and the United States is on Israel's side. So again, we have a situation where the United States, the most powerful state on the planet, is deeply enmeshed in a conflict or a series of conflicts in the Middle East, deeply enmeshed in a series of conflicts in Europe, and at the same time is unable to fully pivot to Asia. Now, another way of looking at this, just thinking about the big picture, is to recognize that what the United States has done in recent years is it has driven Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea close together. They basically form a bloc at this point in time. And on the other side is a different bloc. That bloc is Europe, Israel, and the United States. So you have Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia on one side, and you have the United States, Europe, and Israel on the other side. And those two blocs are at each other's throats. They are major antagonists in the international system. And very importantly, that competition between those two blocs has significant consequences for the Middle East, significant consequences for the Arab world, and significant consequences for the Gulf states. It's very important to understand that. This brings me to what the Middle East looks like after October 7th. So I want to switch gears now and move to the second part of my talk. And I want to talk about sort of what's been going on in the Middle East and where things are headed. It's commonplace in the West, certainly in the United States, to argue that all of the trouble that is now happening in the Middle East is due to Iran. Iran is the master puppeteer, and groups like Hamas and Hezbollah basically follow whatever Iran tells them to do. I think this view is dead wrong. I'm not arguing that Iran doesn't cause any trouble in the Middle East, but the principal country, or the country that is principally responsible for the trouble in the Middle East today, is not Iran, it is Israel. And to understand what Israel is up to and to think about the trouble that is now taking place in the Middle East, it's important to understand that there are three conflicts which are not completely independent of each other, but three different conflicts that have to be analyzed on their own. One is the genocide involving Hamas, and more generally, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Number two, the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. And number three, the conflict between Iran and Israel and the United States. Those three conflicts have to be assessed. Let me start with the genocide in Gaza and talk about what is going on there. Israel is an apartheid state. It's probably better to talk about Greater Israel rather than just Israel. Greater Israel, as you all know, includes Green Line Israel, the Israel that was created after the 1948 war. It includes Gaza, and it includes the West Bank. And Greater Israel is an apartheid state. For anybody who has any doubts about that, there were three major reports that were written by three of the most important human rights groups in the world, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and one other whose name escapes me at the moment, Human Rights Watch. And all three of them have written lengthy reports detailing the fact that Israel is an apartheid state. And what happened on October 7th caused the Israelis to pursue two particular goals vis-a-vis Hamas. Number one, they committed to defeating Hamas. Number two, they committed to getting the hostages back. And people talk about these two goals all the time. The one goal that's not talked about, which is of central importance for the Israelis, is to cleanse Gaza. The Israelis, who recognize full well that Greater Israel is an apartheid state, would like to put an end to that apartheid state, and they'd like to put an end to that apartheid state by driving the Palestinians out of Gaza and driving the Palestinians out of the West Bank and creating a largely homogeneous Jewish state. That's the basic goal. And they see what's going on in Gaza in the wake of October 7th as an opportunity to cleanse Gaza. The basic operating assumption was, to begin with, that by killing a significant number of Palestinians and effectively making Gaza unlivable, the Palestinians would leave. Of course, that has not happened, despite the fact that many Palestinians were killed and Gaza was made to be unlivable. The Palestinians did not leave. So ethnic cleansing has not worked. But in the process, what has happened is that that Israel killing machine has reached the point where it is, in effect, executing a genocide in Gaza. And that is what is taking place now. Now, not only have the Palestinians not left, not only have the Palestinians not been cleansed, but Israel has not defeated Hamas. Hamas is still effectively functioning as a combat organization that is a threat to Israel and that Israel cannot defeat. Just very important to understand that. They have not defeated Hamas. They are not going to defeat Hamas. And they have not gotten the hostages back as well. And again, they have not cleansed Gaza. What about Hezbollah? As you all know, Hezbollah, shortly after October 7th, began to fire rockets and missiles at northern Israel. This resulted in roughly 100,000 Israelis who live in the northern part of Israel moving south to get out of the way of those rockets and missiles. As best I can tell, there are still about 60,000 Israelis who have not gone back to their homes in the north and very much want to. The Israelis, therefore, are deeply committed to trying to put an end to the rockets and missiles that Hezbollah is firing into northern Israel. And the Israelis are pursuing three policies in pursuit of defeating Hezbollah and effectively putting an end to that rocket and missile fire. First of all, they're pursuing a decapitation strategy, which is where they try to kill the leadership of Hezbollah, and they, of course, have been somewhat successful on that front so far. Secondly, they're committed to punishing the civilian population in Lebanon, which basically means killing large numbers of civilians. And then third, they have decided to invade southern Lebanon for the purposes of directly engaging with Hezbollah forces and defeating Hezbollah forces. We have a rich literature in international relations which shows that decapitation strategies do not work. And of course, as you all know, the Israelis have been killing the leaders of various Arab groups over the years, and those decapitation strikes, even though they were effective, have not changed the course of events in any meaningful way. So a decapitation strategy that takes out Nasrallah is not going to matter in the end. Furthermore, we have a rich literature in international relations that shows that inflicting massive punishment on civilian populations hardly ever results in a government or an organization changing its policies. We know this from the bombing of Germany and the bombing of Japan in World War II. So the idea that by killing civilians from the air in Lebanon, you're going to bring Hezbollah to its knees is wrong-headed. And then finally, the third element of the Israeli strategy is to invade southern Lebanon. That's not going to work either. They tried it in 2006, they tried it in 1982, and in both cases they failed, and they're going to fail here. What am I telling you? The end result is that Hezbollah is going to remain a formidable adversary of Israel for the foreseeable future, and it's going to maintain the capability to lob rockets and missiles into northern Israel, which is a huge problem for Israel. So what I'm telling you so far is the Israelis have not defeated Hamas. They have not been able to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and they are not going to defeat Hezbollah. This means these two conflicts are going to go on for a long, long time. This brings us to the third conflict, which is Iran. It's very important to understand that neither Iran nor the United States want to get dragged into a war with each other. And Iran and the United States have been going to considerable lengths to avoid a direct conflict with each other. It's the Israelis, on the other hand, who are deeply committed to getting Iran and the United States into a fight. What the Israelis would really like to see is Iran fight against Israel and the United States together. As you all know, back on April 1st, the Israelis attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus. And that, of course, provoked the Iranians to respond on April 14th by attacking Israel. And then Israel responded on April 19th with a small-scale attack against Iran. So the Israelis then failed to pull the United States and Iran into a major conflict. Nevertheless, on July 31st, as you all know, they murdered the Palestinian leader in Tehran. And this eventually led on October 1st to Iran launching a massive strike involving about 180 ballistic missiles on Israel. And now we're waiting for Israel to respond. And as you all know, if Israel responds, and it surely will respond at some point, Iran is highly likely to counter-respond. And then one would imagine that the Israelis will counter-respond. And what's happening here is we're going up the escalation ladder. And where it all ends, who knows? But the bottom line is that the Israelis have now succeeded in pulling Iran and the United States into a conflict, because the United States will be with Israel as Israel and Iran go up the escalation ladder. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, why are the Israelis doing this? I mean, why are the Israelis so committed to getting Iran deeply involved in a war with the United States? There are a variety of reasons for this. First of all, the Iranians are the boogeyman that keeps the United States involved in the Middle East from Israel's point of view. Trita Parsi has written a very important book on this issue. It was originally his dissertation, where he talked to all sorts of Israelis who said that when the Cold War ended and the Soviet threat disappeared, the Israelis were deeply worried that there would be no formidable threat in the Middle East that would cause the Americans to keep their military in the region and care greatly about the region for strategic purposes. So what the Israelis decided to do was manufacture a threat, to go to great lengths to make the argument that the Iranians were a serious threat to the region, a serious threat to the United States for the purposes of keeping the Americans there. Furthermore, given all the trouble in the Middle East, and given the importance of the Palestinian issue as, I would argue, the taproot of the trouble in the Middle East, certainly the taproot of the trouble today, if you portray the Iranians as the root of all evil, as the cause of the trouble in the Middle East, it takes attention away from the argument that it is Israel that is causing the problem. So Israel and the United States have a vested interest in arguing that Iran is the master puppeteer. This has nothing to do with the Palestinian issue. It's all about Iran. So if you draw Iran into a conflict with the United States, you're guaranteed to get the Americans to see Iran as the cause of all the trouble. Then the third factor is that Iran is close to having nuclear weapons. It's not far away from the point where it can develop a nuclear arsenal. And this concerns the Israelis greatly. And what they want the United States to do is to use its formidable military force to attack Iran's nuclear facilities and eliminate those nuclear facilities once and for all. So what you have here is a situation where the United States, right, is slowly but steadily being drawn into a bigger and bigger war with Iran. And the question you want to ask yourself is, where does this all lead? Now, if you listen to the Israelis talk, and you listen to many of Israel's supporters in the United States talk, they talk about remaking the Middle East. We're going to remake the Middle East. And of course, when they talk about remaking the Middle East, they're not only talking about Iran, they're talking about Hezbollah, and they're talking about Hamas as well. Well, they may remake the Middle East. The Israelis and the Americans together may remake the Middle East. I have doubts about that, but they're not going to remake it in a way that they think is desirable. The idea that Iran is going to be neutralized once and for all, Hezbollah is going to be defeated, Hamas is going to be defeated, and the Palestinian problem is going to be solved because of successful ethnic cleansing. That's not going to happen, right? Hamas is here to stay. Hezbollah is here to stay. Iran is here to stay. And indeed, Iran has a formidable retaliatory capability against Israel, which is not to be underestimated, which makes it very difficult for Israel and the United States together to deal with Iran in an effective or heavy-handed way as they would like to. So there's no evidence that these three problems are going to be solved. But just to dig deeper for a second here, as I told you before, the problem here in the Middle East is not principally Iranian behavior. I don't want to make the argument the Iranians are the ultimate good guys. That's not my argument. The Iranians do cause their share of trouble. But the Iranians are not the principal cause of the trouble that we face today. The taproot of the problem is the Palestinian problem. If the Palestinians had some meaningful form of sovereignty, if there had been a two-state solution a long time ago, then there would not be a conflict involving Hamas. And if there was no conflict involving Hamas, there would be no conflict involving Hezbollah. And with regard to Iran, there is no reason that the Iranians and the Americans should be mortal enemies. I have spent a lot of time studying U.S.-Iranian relationships since 1979. And when you look carefully at that relationship, the Iranians on numerous occasions have tried to improve relations with the United States. And every time the Iranians have tried to do that, and the Americans have shown any evidence of improving relations with Iran, the Israel lobby has moved in the United States and scotched that movement towards rapprochement. Because, as I said to you before, the Israelis want to make sure that the United States and Iran have bad relations forever and ever. So that's where we are. So my bottom line to you is that until we solve the Palestinian problem, which we are not going to solve, right? Not going to be solved, there's going to be endless trouble in the Middle East. And that endless trouble is going to include Hamas and the Palestinians, and not only Gaza, but the West Bank as well. It's going to include Lebanon, and it's going to include Iran. And because we have this block in international politics that involves Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea, there's always the possibility that you will not only have escalation inside the region, there is a serious possibility, for example, that the Russians, who are now moving closer and closer to the Iranians, and who, as you all know, are deeply involved in Syria, would get pulled into this conflict as well. So the potential for danger is great. I want to conclude on one note about the Palestinians. I worry greatly about the future of the Palestinians. I mean, of course, what's happening to the Palestinians today is absolutely horrible, and I don't want to make light of that for 1 second. But I worry greatly that things might get even worse. And that is because, as I said before, the Israelis are deeply committed to ethnically cleansing the Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank. And furthermore, I think it's highly likely that with the passage of time, the Israeli government will become more and more and more right-wing, more and more hawkish, more and more committed to ethnic cleansing. And at the same time, because of the power of the Israel lobby in the United States, the more the Israelis push to get the Palestinians out of Gaza and West Bank, the more the United States will support them. The United States will back Israel unconditionally. And I think that when you put all this together and you assess what is likely to happen to the Palestinians moving forward, it is a really depressing and scary story. Thank you.